So we are in the final week of our series, Godly Girls and Wild Women. And you guys know by now, if you have been here, the series has been designed out of the genealogy of Jesus found in Matthew chapter number 1. And really looking at the breaks in that genealogy where we see something different. And we're going to work our way through and talk about that. I'm going to do a little bit of a review. It's good to be here with you, like the entire day today, by the way. And so I just want you to know that whenever I have to travel, like I have the last couple of weeks, I miss being here with you guys and being able to talk to you before the gathering and talk to you after the gathering. I miss that, so I'm glad to be here with you kind of full time today, and I'll be here after the gathering. We'll have a chance to be able to talk. So we started our series out with a message titled Imperfect to Beautiful, and we really built that out of Ecclesiastes chapter number 3, verse 11, which says that God has made everything beautiful in its time. And we began to ask the question, what is your journey to beautiful? Because as we look at the genealogy and we see that break, the normal pattern in the genealogy of Matthew chapter number 1, and you can look at this yourself. If you don't have a Bible, strongly encourage you. We have some in the little stand right back there as you walk out. Love for you to grab one, take that. It can be yours. You can keep it, write your name in it, bring it back week after week, read it at home, all of those things. In that pattern, Matthew chapter number 1, if you use the Bible app, you can find it there too. You'll find the normal pattern being this person, the father of this person. 5 times it breaks, and we are told, okay, here's who the mother is. And so many times, and I was actually thinking about this as we were singing that last song, because we look at certain things and we say, man, I don't know. If our God is for us, then who can ever stop us? And we say, well, but there are times that I didn't feel like God was for me. And I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand or anything like that if you can kind of say, yeah, you know what, there were times in my life that I just threw up my hands and said, God, I don't even know if you're for me anymore. You know, we're going to see today that God being for you maybe doesn't look like what you thought it would. See, our idea many times is if God is for us, and we did not sing these words, by the way. Our idea many times is if God is for us, then life will be easy. If God is for us, then I won't have any heartache. If God is for us, then I'll never lose my job. If God is for us, then I'll never be made fun of. And so we have this kind of warped definition of what we believe God being for us is. And I think you're going to see that kind of flipped upside down. Actually, this whole series has kind of flipped that upside down. I trust that it's meant as much to you as it has for me. So we see these 5 times. We talked about 2 weeks ago the faith of Rahab. And you'll remember Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho. Jericho was the land that they were going to go in, the Israelites, and conquer. They were going to cross the Jordan River. They were going to go and they were going to conquer Jericho because God had said, I'm going to give you that land as your inheritance, as your possession. Rahab, though, like what's God using Rahab for? Well, Rahab hides the spies, and God actually delivers her and her family through the destruction. And we see that she has this, what I titled, unlikely faith. You probably wouldn't have said, you know what, as I think about all the people in Jericho, I'm guessing God's using the prostitute. Like, I doubt that most people would say, you know, I had that figured out. How many of you like to watch, like, mysteries? You know what I'm talking about, like mysteries on TV? How many of you tried? I feel like there aren't as many good ones as what there used to be. And, like, by good ones, I just mean, like, okay, so I used to watch, like, those old ones. What's that? Matlock, yes. And so my mom and I would watch these together, and we would try to figure out at the beginning of them who the murderer was. Anybody ever watched like Matlock, or what's the one with the lady there? Murder, She Wrote. Yeah, that just kind of escaped me for a second. So you watch these things and you try to guess how it's going to end up. I mean, nobody is guessing this story, right? Nobody's saying, I know. Like when they go into Jericho, it's clear that God's going to pick a prostitute and like... No, like God has a crazy way of working. And what we saw is that she had faith that was actually, as I look at it, stronger than most of the Israelites, because she was able to say, I just heard what your God did. And like when I heard that, I was all in. Like, I know that that's the one and only true God. And so we said there's never a wrong time to place your faith in God. And if you already have your faith placed in God, there's never a wrong time to share your faith in God, because you know what? You might be the next hero of the faith. And then one of the kind of recurring themes throughout this series is this: God's not ashamed of your story. You know what? If you have some ugliness in your story, God's not ashamed of that. And he doesn't want you to be ashamed of it either. All right, so we went from there, and last week we preached on Tamar. Whew, Tamar. Like, we read through that in Genesis chapter number 38, and really, as you look at it, nobody makes a good decision throughout the entire chapter. And you look at that and you say, well, why did God pause and tell us that Tamar is part of this genealogy? Like, we talked last week, like, if we were telling our family story, we leave out the ugly parts, right? We just don't talk about cousin so-and-so. We don't talk about Uncle what's his name. We don't do that because, like, we realize that's an ugly part of our story. And so most of us in our family histories, if we're talking about our family histories, we leave out the ugliness. And so the natural question I asked is, God, why did you tell us that Tamar is there? You read through that and you see, like, this just crazy story developed, and we preached through it last week. And here's what God gave me with that. You know, you either came here with a godly, and these were the two main things last week. You either came with a godly heritage, or you could leave determined to start one, because you were only 2 generations away from someone saying, you know what, the faith of my grandma, the faith of my grandpa, I have a godly heritage. But the challenge also at the end was this: you know what? If you came here with a godly heritage, you're only 2 generations away from your grandkids not even having any faith. Saying what? Like, the challenge is this: if you came with a godly heritage, continue to rejoice in that and pass it down. If you came here without a godly heritage, start one. Make it start today. And so that was the challenge from last week. Well, I'm going to be in a kind of odd passage to start out. We're going to start out in 1 Corinthians chapter number 13, which, if you kind of know and designate any chapters in the Bible, this is the love chapter, right? And you say, well, why are we starting with the love chapter? Aren't we going to talk about Ruth? And maybe you didn't know we were talking about Ruth today. If you didn't know, we're going to talk about Ruth. And we're going to be back in the book of Ruth. But to start with, Faith, Hope, and Love is the title of today's message. And we read in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1, says this, and Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and he says, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, as you read God's word, you want to kind of process it, right? And so, I mean, this is an easy verse to read and to process and to say, okay, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, that sounds like I'm doing something right. Am I right about that? Sounds like that's a pretty good thing. But it says if I do that and don't have love, I'm like a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. It would be like Pastor Dave getting on the drums and just beating on them. And everybody would kind of plug their ears. It just would not sound good. It would be painful to the ears. And so if you don't have love as you're doing even good things, it just is terrible. Verse 2 says, if I have the gift of prophecy, again, sounds like a good thing, right? And can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge. And if I have a faith that can move mountains. I mean, these are good things, but do not have love, I am nothing. And so we're reading here, okay, love seems like a fairly important thing. And do you remember last week I said that there is like a universal unifier? So like our stories don't have to be the same. Our family histories don't have to be the same. We don't have to have the same ugliness in our families. We don't have to have the same problems, the same issues, the same victories, the same wins. We don't have to have those things because we have this universal unifier, which is love. And we see this in 1 Corinthians 13. It goes on to say, if I give all I have to the poor, and I give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Like, love seems really important. Skipping down a few verses, it says, love never fails. Where there are prophecies, again, very good, they'll cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. And now these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. As we look at the story of Ruth today, you're going to see faith, you're going to see hope, and you're going to see love in her story. Hers is a beautiful story that comes out of a lot of pain and hardship. And you're going to see that this word hope, it was necessary to sustain her, to sustain her mother-in-law through a lot of very difficult hardship. And most of you maybe came in saying, I don't know anything about the story of Ruth. How many of you have read or know really well the story of Ruth? Anybody? Okay, so actually a decent number of people. The challenge in preaching through a series like this is that because these lessons are built so much around the stories of these folks. So the story of Rahab, the lesson was built around what God was doing there. The story of Tamar, like a pretty unusual story, not one that like, hey, tell me your favorite Bible story. Yeah, Tamar. Judah and Tamar. I've yet to have a kid raise their hand and say like that. You know, you might hear Daniel in the lion's den, you know. You might hear Jonah in the belly of the big fish. You might hear about a lot of these different things, but you don't hear most of the time about Ruth, Tamar, Rahab. You don't usually. So all that to say that, like, I'm going to kind of share the entire story, which means we're going to read a lot of Scripture, which seems like a right thing to do in a church anyway, right? Sounds like a pretty good thing. So we're going to read through the entire chapter of Ruth chapter number 1. We're going to read through a good portion of Ruth chapter number 2. I'm going to summarize Ruth chapter number 3, and we're going to see some verses in Ruth chapter number 4. All right? So buckle up. Open up your Bibles if you have them. We're going to read through the story of Ruth. And just kind of as we prepare to do that, I already showed this to you. The reason we're doing this is that Ruth is going to be going to marry Boaz. You're going to find this later. They're going to have a son named Obed, and you're going to find that this person, Ruth, is going to be the great-grandmother of King David. How many of you have heard King David? Most of you. I mean, that sounds like a pretty, yeah. All right, going to be the great-grandmother of King David. But there's a big problem, and you're going to see this as we kind of go through this together. There's a big problem. Bethlehem right here. That's where you're going to find a lady by the name of Naomi living. You're also going to find that there's somebody living there by the name of Boaz. Now, previous slide, you saw that Boaz is going to marry who? Going to marry Ruth. All right, you guys are following along. Now, here's the problem. Boaz lives here. Ruth lives down here. Totally different country, totally different land. How's God going to make that happen? That's a good question. That's why we're going to read it together. All right, Ruth chapter number 1, verse number 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, I'm going to back up. Remember, we have family living in Bethlehem. We have famine that happens, so they're going to move to Moab. So you're starting to see already how, okay, God, you need somebody that's living here to marry somebody that's living here in order to continue your lineage in the way that you want to. And so we see that there's a famine that happens. By the way, if you kind of look backwards, it's not like the first time that God has used a famine. You remember that whenever Joseph is sold into slavery, he's sold into Egypt, uses a famine. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Whose family ends up moving all the way down to Egypt? We find the Israelites, Israel, Jacob, moving the entire family down there. Here we find a famine moving a family from Bethlehem down to Moab. You're going to see that God is working in all of this. All right, so the man who moved along with his wife, his name was Elimelech. And, all right, I just have to sometimes lighten things up. So I'm reading through this week. And how many of you have ever watched Lion King? So like you have that, I don't even know what the word is, but I kept thinking, as I read this, every time I read it, I'm like, Elimelech, Elimelech, Elimelech. Does anyone else's mind, like, is anyone else's mind warped that way? No? I'm sorry, every time I see that, that's all that goes through my head, and so I needed to, like, let you know what was in my head. All right, let's keep going. All right, so this man's name is Elimelech. Now, every time you read it, you're going to think the same thing now. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Again, we saw the map, right? Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. You'll remember they're Mahlon and Chilion, right? Well, those two sons, they married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So now you have Naomi's husband is dead. You have the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They have now died, but they had married before they died, so we now have two daughters-in-law. We have Orpah and we have Ruth. And so we have Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. All right, you guys are following the story so far. All right, very good. All right, so Naomi is now left without her two sons and without her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people, now remember, what was taking place back in Bethlehem? There was a what taking place? There was a famine. So now whenever we read that Naomi hears, okay, God has come to their aid and he's providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me." By sticking with Naomi, they were showing great kindness. They could have gone and they could have married other men and continued and had families, and they hadn't done that to this point. They had stuck with Naomi. They had shown great kindness to her, and she says, "You know, I appreciate that you have done that, but go back." Says, Naomi continues on, "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home. Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you really wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." I just want to say a word here. Everybody say the word perspective. Say it one more time. Say the word perspective. Okay, now, what you need to realize is that God's word always gives us truth. But in giving us truth, not everything is true. Now, here's what I mean by that. Naomi's perspective, that was her perspective, so that is truth. But her thoughts toward God were not true. Sometimes your thoughts about God are not accurate. She had this perspective that God had turned against her. Everybody say the word perspective. Okay, her perspective was that God was against her. But that was not at all true. Now, you remember I said, God needed somebody in Bethlehem to marry somebody in Moab. He needed to be able to get these two people together. God is working behind the scenes whenever we don't realize that he is. So her perspective is, God's against me. And I would guess that some of you have come in here today and at points in your life when things have not gone right, and I use right very in quotation marks because we all have the idea of what we feel like should happen in our lives, right? And most of us, if we had our way, we would say, I will choose like a smooth path with really no obstacles, and like just let me live, let me enjoy life, let me die, and I'll be good with that. Like, most of us would sign up for that, and oftentimes that's not God's journey for us. I don't know any better way to say it than to just let you know that God's path for you is not always designed to be easy. It's just not. And so like we have this warped perspective that if everything's going right, God is for us and he has blessed us. Right? You've probably heard that before, right? God has blessed me so much, and then I have yet to hear, God has blessed me so much, here's the crazy, difficult thing I'm going through. It's always, God has blessed me so much, look at what good thing happened, right? Because we have this warped way of thinking that God's blessing is always associated with prosperity. It's associated with easy times. And what we need to understand is that this perspective is wrong. The Lord's hand was not against her. It was not against her family. And you're going to see, she's going to elaborate even more on this in just a moment. But I just need you to understand perspective. It's the wrong perspective. And oftentimes we have the wrong. I will say, as your pastor, I approach life, and I have at times, I almost hate to say this, there have been many times I have the wrong perspective. And the Lord has to correct me over and over and over again, because it's very easy for me to fall into that same way of thinking. Good, God is blessing. Bad, God is punishing. Now, sometimes God will use correction and punishment to bring us to the right place, but not everything is God's discipline. So we just need to understand proper perspective. All right, so she says, go back. God's against me, go back. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. So now we've gone from Elimelech and Naomi with their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They then marry, Elimelech dies, then they marry, and they have Orpah and Ruth. Well, the two sons had died, so we were left with Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Now Orpah has decided to go back. We're now left with Naomi and Ruth, right? All right, so everybody say Naomi. Everybody say Ruth. Okay, so those are the two we're left with at this point. And Naomi's saying, go back. Go back. Like, you've been very kind. I get that. I appreciate that. But, like, I want what's best for you. Like, just go back. Ruth replies with this, and this is crazy. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I'll die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Now you have to realize that in the land of Moab, they didn't worship the one true God. But I find it interesting in verse number 16, as we read that, she says, listen, your people will be my people, your God, my God. Now, titled this Faith, Hope, and Love. Everybody say faith. We've seen faith out of Rahab, who was a prostitute in Jericho. We now see faith from Ruth, who grew up in the land of Moab, where they didn't worship the one true God. And she says, you know what? I want your God to be my God. This is not a casual thing. This is not a casual commitment. She's saying, I am all in. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the woman exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Now, I just want you to pause for a second. And again, I encourage you to think about the scriptures as we read them. Sometimes I feel like when I read them, you just kind of listen and maybe don't. I hope you're processing. Okay, so we have Naomi who was left. She left Bethlehem to go to Moab with her husband Elimelech. There was a famine. She comes back, and it's about 10, maybe 11 years later, remember, and they say, can this be Naomi? Now, why do you think they would have said, like, can this be Naomi? Now, in 10 years, I know that there's a lot that happens with a person, but typically, if I see someone, and I've seen them for a consistent period of time, and 10 years later I see them again, I normally can recognize them. And they ask, like, can this be Naomi? Why do you think that question? I got a couple ideas. Hardship, it ages a person. The stress of having lost her husband. The stress of having lost her two sons. The stress of then being in a country that wasn't her own, not surrounded by family, not surrounded by a support system. That's been a lot, right? And so as we read verse number 20 and we continue on, we see she had gone through a lot. She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Now, I just like to throw in little bits of biblical history for you. So pause this story for a second, a little bit of biblical history. If you recognize, if you say, I feel like I read that word Mara somewhere before. As the Israelites are leaving Egypt, and they have gone, and they've actually traveled 3 days without water, and they finally get to a place where there is water. But as they begin to taste the water is bitter. And so they call that place Mara, because it was bitter. So Naomi says, just call me Mara, because like my life has been very bitter. Now she says this, and again, everybody say the word perspective. Her perspective is the Almighty God has made her life very bitter. So just call me Mara. I don't even want you to call me Naomi. My life is miserable. There is nothing good that has happened in my life. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Everybody say the word perspective. Okay, because sometimes whenever you read through this, you're like, oh, wow, yeah, God did. Like, he was just against her. I'm telling you, God wasn't against her. And in the toughest times of your life, God has not been against you either. All right, so last verse of the chapter. So Naomi returned from Moab. This is kind of a summarizing verse. Accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Naomi's experience. Dealt with a famine, went to a new country. Dealt with the death of a husband, marriage of 2 sons, which would have been a positive thing, but then the death of those 2 sons, and now is returning to her homeland. And if I was just to ask you a question, where do you see God working in this? What would your answer be? If I was to ask you, like, where do you see God working in any of this? Most of us would pick the positives, right? Okay, so, wow, that's something good. So God must have had a hand in it. Can I just say that God was working through the famine? God was working as they moved to a new country. God was working even the death of the husband. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that God caused the death of the husband, that God caused the death of the 2 sons. I'm not saying that at all. And that's where we need to keep in mind Romans 8, which I'll show you here in just a minute. That in all things, God is working for the good of those who love him. It doesn't say that God makes every negative thing happen and then he responds to it. God is working in everything, and so he was working in this. So Romans 8:28 that I just referenced, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. But God's working is different than our working. God needed to take someone here and get them married to someone here. How's he going to do that? Well, he makes it all come together. So big point from today, God is working even when no one sees it. Even if you feel like you would have done your life differently, and I would guess that there are a number of people in here that would say, if I could just rewrite my story, there's some parts I would leave out. If I could rewrite my story, I would be in this location. I would be with this person. I would have this happen. I would have this not happen. I would leave out this ugliness, all of this. I want you to know that God is working even when no one sees it. You might have done some things that completely dishonored the Lord. I want you to know that God can take even those broken things, and we talked about this a number of weeks ago, and he can redeem them. And so don't give up on yourself, because God's not giving up on you. And he's not done with your story, and he's not ashamed of it. All right, Ruth chapter number 2. So we have them back in Bethlehem now. We have Ruth and Naomi. Mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, they're back together. So Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, I'm going to back up to last week again. I feel like I'm having to do a lot of teaching. Hopefully you're okay with that. I hope you like to learn. All right, so last week when we talked about Tamar, do you remember? So she married the oldest son. That oldest son was killed by God. And then she, because of this idea of redeeming the family name, carrying it on. They have what's called a kinsman redeemer or a guardian redeemer. And so the second son then had to marry, do you remember this from last week? Had to marry Tamar. Judah didn't want to give the third son because the first one died, the second one died, and he just thought, well, Tamar is cursed. We see the same idea here. And so I just want to kind of implant that in your head. Like back in that culture, it's different today. I want you to know, back in that culture, somebody from the family would marry to carry on the name of the oldest son. And so we have the two sons who are dead, and we see that Naomi has a relative on her husband's side. That's Elimelech. That's the husband's name. So he's from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she's having to take care, so she goes into the field. Remember, they came back during the barley harvest. So she went out, entered a field, began to glean behind the harvesters. Now, of course, God probably doesn't have anything figured out at this point, right? So she's just going to go to some random field of some random person, and no, God is working already. As it turned out, like purely by coincidence, of course, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Now, we already know from verse number 1 that Boaz is what? He's from the clan of Elimelech. And we understand this idea of a guardian redeemer or a kinsman redeemer, and so somebody in a family has to marry to carry on that name. So who's going to marry Ruth to carry on the name? We'll find out. I mean, you can probably guess at this point, right? So she goes to this field of a man by the name of Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? So he notices Ruth. And the overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. I'm going to skip down to verse number 10 where we find out, so between verse 6 that I just read and verse 10, Boaz basically says, hey, listen, says to Ruth, I want to take care of you. So like, listen, go behind the harvesters and pick up the grain. Nobody's going to harm you. You're going to be taken care of. He eventually talks to the people doing the harvest, is like, hey, kind of slip her some extra if you can do that. Like, take care of her. Invites her to eat with them. All of these things, treating her really well. And so Ruth asks, like, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me and I'm a foreigner? Like, I don't really get it. And Boaz replies, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother, your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. So I've heard about you. And what you have done is really, really honorable. And he says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, okay, remember perspective. Everybody say the word perspective. Okay, so it's weird because Naomi has this perspective that God is completely against her. And Boaz is looking at the same story, and he's saying, wow, you know, the God of Israel, he's the one that's giving you refuge. Like, I can see that he is doing something in protecting you. I can see that he's doing something in that story. So two different people looking at the same story, one saying, wow, you have found refuge under the hand and the wings of the Almighty God. Naomi saying, I feel like God is completely against me. I want you to get something, hopefully you can wrap your head around this point. The perspective of the person living the story is usually the worst. Another way of saying that might be sometimes an outside perspective can be the best way of looking at your situation. Because you've had to live your story. And you see all the ugliness of that story. And typically, and we're kind of programmed this way, aren't we? We see negatives. Parents, you're good at it. You're good at seeing bad stuff. If I was to ask you, like, tell me about your week. Tell me about your kids this week. Most of you can remember they spilled the milk. They did this. They did that. We can usually pick out negatives, right? I've tried to retrain myself in some respects, but I'm still not really good at this. If I watch a soccer game, I usually can pick out the negatives from that soccer game faster than I can pick out the positives. I have to force myself sometimes to say positive things. Caleb, yesterday, he asked me, Kim was texting me. Hopefully you don't mind this, Kylie. Kim was texting me. Kim was at Kylie's match. I was at Caleb's match. Kim was texting me, and Kylie knows this, so it's not a big deal. Said, this match is hard to watch. In other words, it was an ugly match. It was like watching the Cavs the other night, okay? No, it was. Listen, I root for the Cavs. I'll be honest, I switched the channel. Anyway. Sometimes things are hard to watch. Okay, so she texted me and said, man, that was hard to watch. And the first question Caleb asked was my match hard to watch? Well, he had lost 5-0. And it wasn't a totally painful match to watch, but it wasn't good either. I mean, you don't get beat 5-0 and it'd be good. So I had to come up, okay, what are some positives? It's easy for us as we live our story to see the negatives, right? So perspective. An outside perspective on this said, wow, Ruth, man, I see how God is protecting you. And I really appreciate what you've done. So sometimes an outside perspective is really good. Now, here's the tough thing. So this is just, okay, at this point, I've lived enough of life to have lived through some of me having really bad perspectives. How many of you have lived through having a really bad perspective of your own situation? All right, so all of you are over the age of about 15. All right, good. So you realize, now, the tough thing is this. You ever had somebody from the outside give you a perspective you didn't like? They see that and they say, well, maybe what God is doing, no, there's nothing good. There's nothing good. Sometimes an outside perspective can really, really do a lot of good. So Boaz has a really interesting perspective. Well, so Ruth's mother-in-law asked Ruth, hey, where did you glean today? Comes back, has a good harvest, all of that. Where'd you go? Where'd you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she says. Oh, the Lord bless him, Naomi says to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead. And so she sees that Boaz is showing kindness not only to Ruth, but really to the family. Remember, he's part of that family, the family of Elimelech. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it'll be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, let's just catch up real quick. I'm going to keep moving on. So Ruth and Boaz, they lived in different countries to start with. God needs to bring them together. So there's a famine, and the family of Elimelech and Naomi, they moved to Moab. All right, so now Ruth and Boaz, after everybody has died off, so we have the husband that's died off, the two boys that have died off. Naomi decides to go back. One of her daughters-in-law decides to stay, but Naomi and Ruth come back. So they're now in the same country. They're now in the same field. And they're now in the same location. All right, so we said God needs to be able to bring together two people in different countries. By the way, back then they didn't have the internet. And online dating. I don't know. Maybe, sometimes I feel like I'm weird in the way that I read the Bible. I sometimes am like, well, what if that story happened today? Would God have written that story in such a way as he sends somebody to an online dating site and somebody in another country sends back and says, I have a inheritance that I want to give to you if you would just send me. You guys have never gotten those scam emails? All right, I was trying to be funny for a second. Never mind, I won't be funny. We'll keep moving on. They're now in the same place. They have now met. Kylie just shakes her head. She's like, Dad, just preach. All right, so main point, God is working even when no one sees it, right? All right, so chapter number 3, I said I'm going to summarize this. All right, so Ruth and Boaz, they become better acquainted. Boaz agrees to become Ruth's guardian redeemer. Remember, somebody in the family could marry the widow of the oldest son, Okay, and then that person, the son, would carry on that family name. So Boaz says, you know what? I'm willing to do that. But there's a problem. Another relative is actually closer in line to become the guardian redeemer. So, chapter number 4. Boaz goes and he talks to this man, the one that's next in line. He says, you know, hey, Naomi's going to sell her estate. Do you want to redeem it? If you redeem it, I need you to know you're also going to get Ruth. And so you're going to have to marry Ruth in order to be the guardian redeemer. So at this, the guardian redeemer, who is not Boaz at this point, it's the first one in line, says, I can't redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it for yourself. I cannot do it. Everybody say these words. Say, God is working. Even when no one sees it. All right, God is working even when no one sees it. All right, and so God has been working through this whole story, starting all the way back at the famine, starting at them going down to Moab, all through, even when the husband dies, even when the son dies, he's working through all of it. And now he has them together. Now, I find it interesting. I kind of like some cultural pieces as well. We read in verse number 7 that in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party had to take off his sandal and gives it to the other person. And so here's what's happening. And they're sitting there and they're saying, okay, you redeem it. And so he takes off. I just have shoes, and so it's not going to work. He takes off his sandal and he hands that over. So this is just the way that it happened in those times. And he says, all right, so here's the deal. Buy it yourself, Boaz, you can do that. So he takes his sandal off, he gives it to Boaz. Boaz announced to the elders and to all the people, today you're witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. I'm not going to go into why the whole 7 sons thing, but then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. Now, it wasn't Naomi's son, was it? But they looked at it and they said, wow, God has given her this child through Ruth, through Boaz. So they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And you see that God is working through the whole story. So, here's where I'm going to wrap up today. God is working behind the scenes in your life. He's working all things together for good. We saw that in Romans 8, as I trust and follow him. So there's probably been some ugliness in your life. There have been some things that you said, God's hand seems to be against me. I don't understand, God, what you're doing. And I just want to say this. God is working behind the scenes even when no one else seems to realize it. So what's your story? As we wrap up this series of godly girls and wild women, and we look at that genealogy, and we see the pauses, and we ask ourselves, why the pauses? And we look at these stories, and we say, wow, it doesn't seem like our typical way of looking at the blessing of God. It looks like, wow, there's a lot of hardship. Wow, there's a lot of heartache. And I just want to say this again and again. God is working even when no one sees it. Father, I want to pray over these, your people. This series has been, at least for me, interesting just to be reminded of how you have taken broken people and you have brought about your plans. In this instance, Lord, you took Elimelech and Naomi from one land, from one country to another country. You brought Naomi and Ruth, and whenever Naomi left Bethlehem, didn't even know Ruth, didn't have any clue she was ever going to meet Ruth. But you brought their lives together, brought them back, and then you continued on your line as you allowed Ruth to meet Boaz and Boaz to become the guardian redeemer and carry on the line. And I just sometimes have to throw up my hands and say, only you, God, could bring about good from what seemed like a really messy situation. So So today, Lord, if there are those in this gathering who look at their life and they see their perspective is, my life's a mess. God's against me. If God was for me, everything would be better. God, I pray that you would help them to see that even through the messiness of life, that you sustain them and you are working behind the scenes to bring about the greatest good and accomplish your plan for your glory. So, Lord, I really just pray today that we would have a changed perspective, that we would see things through the eyes of understanding that say, your word says that in all things you're working for the good of those who love you. And so I see the faith of Ruth. I see the hope that not only she had, but that Naomi eventually came to understand. And I see a deep love that Ruth had for her mother-in-law. I see a deep love that you developed between Boaz and Ruth. I see a deep love that you had through the entire story. I pray that today our perspective can see your love, that we can place our faith completely in you and hope in your promises. And I pray this in Jesus' name.